Hello, I'm Dr. Adam Horsley. I'm a lecturer in French here at the University of Exeter, and my research specialism is in early modern French studies. And this is the first of 3 videos in which I'll be offering an introduction to this text, Voltaire's Candide. We're about to study a real adventure story with Voltaire, about a young man called Candide, who becomes separated from his girl Cunégonde and literally scours the globe trying to get her back. Visiting several countries, most of which are at war, Candide and his band of friends are constantly attacked, trapped, captured, tricked and driven away as they repeatedly come up against the senseless violence and persecution of a world on fire. And all the time they're talking and philosophizing about why there is so much evil and suffering in the world and how one can live a happy life, all in the space of this really rather slim tome. And what a text it is as well. Over the course of this relatively short little book, you're going to get pirates, you're going to get rape and murder, storms and earthquakes. You're going to get cities paved with gold and rubies. You're going to get bestiality. You're going to get gay shared shower scenes of a fashion. And as you'll know if you've got as far as chapter 4, some travellers on this journey are even going to get syphilis. In the book, I mean. Anyway, it's a wonderful and very much loved part of the French literary canon. It's divided into very episodic, self-contained little chapters, and so there really is never a dull moment with this text. So here's a breakdown of our 3 videos, and this first video is perhaps going to be the most difficult and if you like, the kind of least action-packed, because I'll be giving you an outline of the main philosophical ideas, if you like, that colour Candide's narrative. And that's because you really will appreciate and enjoy the story more once you know something about this ideological and philosophical context. In video 2, I'll give some examples of analysing characters, as well as analysing a passage of the text. And then in the third video, I'll give some examples of tracking certain themes throughout the text, as well as discussing what lessons the text might have for us. Why read this little book then? Following the 1615 Charlie Hebdo attacks, the Marche républicaine that took place saw Voltaire's name cropping up time and again. One man interviewed in the street simply said to the camera, "N'oublions pas Voltaire," let us not forget Voltaire. The march itself was directed down the Boulevard Voltaire, and in the first month alone following the Charlie Hebdo attacks, 120,000 copies of Voltaire's Traité sur la tolérance were sold. An article on the BBC website about free speech in France shows a statue of Voltaire in a garden. We might even go as far as to say a well-cultivated garden at that. And so what I'm getting at here is that this is an author who clearly has a place in even modern French culture, in the modern French conscious. But why? Well, because in terms of the history of thought, it's really a rather modern text, is Voltaire's Candide. It's a text that was forged, for example, in the Enlightenment, or le siècle des Lumières in French. And this is a movement occurring in the later part of the 18th century. It is an age of reason over superstition, of equality over privilege, of freedom over suppression. Scientific theories of past centuries were the result of conversation, of internal reflection and thought, without necessarily experimentation. What I mean by that is that to the pre-modern mind, it wasn't necessary to observe something happening or to experiment with it in order to deduce empirical fact and knowledge from it. Voltaire's text, however, is constantly playing with the notion of, if you like, learned experience, the idea that we form judgments on things after we have experienced them. And crucially in Voltaire's Candide, there is this tension throughout the text between those characters on the one hand who are willing to experience out there in the big wide world and to change their views accordingly, and then on the other hand, those who prefer to talk about things, to theorize, and who are perhaps a little bit blinkered, a little bit dismissive of life experience, trying to tell them something that is contrary to what they have read in a book. And so in the Enlightenment, if you like, as one historian puts it, a mood of acceptance was beginning to be replaced with a mood of protest during the Enlightenment. And so as you read Candide, I'd encourage you to consider the themes of judgment, of experience, of belief, because there is a tension between how different people, if you like, make their minds up about what it is that they are going to believe. A key Enlightenment term is the philosophe. Now, this doesn't just mean a philosopher, but also a social and political critic and an advocate for social reform. The philosophe seeks to change society for the better, and Voltaire is known for being precisely one of these philosophes, and the journey of Candide is one in which the views of the philosophe are basically demonstrated, corroborated through worldly lived experience. And I think there are two people whose musings are of crucial importance to our text from Voltaire's day: Gottfried Leibniz and Alexander Pope. Now, Leibniz had proposed a theory of optimism, which isn't necessarily optimism in the modern sense, in his essay on the goodness of God, the freedom of man, and the origin of evil in 1710. And Pope had offered his own optimist views in his essays on man in 1733. So you might actually have noticed that the title of our text by Voltaire is precisely Candide ou l'optimisme. So Candide clearly, from the very title page, has these stakes in mind within its debates. What does this mean, though? The problem for Christian believers is this: if evil exists, then that must mean that either God is evil because he allows it, or God cannot stop evil, and therefore he's not all-powerful like the Bible says he is. So if you're a sincere church-going Christian in Voltaire's day, how are you going to reconcile those two facts? How are you going to square that circle? Leibniz's theory was this one: God chooses for our earth, very important phrase for Candide now, the best of all possible worlds. That means that God created the universe and God is all good. So the universe must only necessarily contain the minimum amount of evil. So, for example, the minimum amount of evil for us to give to charity and look pious like the Bible tells us to, enough crime for us to show mercy, enough punishment for God to be just, etc. And so if only God can be perfect, then of course our world isn't perfect, because we don't worship the world, we worship God. And so this best of all possible worlds, and again this is a phrase we see time and again in our text, this best of all possible worlds contains the minimum amount of evil for God's plan, and for an imperfect world to be distinguishable from a perfect God. Now, This isn't a philosophy video, this isn't necessarily a philosophical text. I'm certainly not a philosophy lecturer, but that will be my kind of way of explaining Leibniz. Pope's theory, that second chap who's writing on this theory of optimism at the time, his is a theory that slightly differs from Leibniz. Pope says there isn't actually evil at all. We're just incapable of understanding the divine plan, the divine harmony. And here on screen are some verses by Pope where he's saying what I've just said, basically. And so if we sum this up in two easy sentences, Leibniz says that there is evil, but there's only the minimum amount of it, and it's for the best. Pope says that there isn't really evil, it's just God's plan, and we're two minuscule, insignificant creatures in the vast universe to be able to understand those vast plans. And so for the philosophe, perhaps even for some of us today, whether we be Christians or atheists, is the question of, well, what's the point in life? What's the purpose? What are we supposed to do in life? Leibniz says improve yourself. Pope says submit yourself. Go along with it. Now, the problem of optimism is that we can't actually improve anything. But Voltaire is an Enlightenment thinker. He doesn't want inaction. He wants to learn, to experiment, to change, to improve. He is what we call in philosophical terms a meliorist. And you can perhaps see in that term meliorist the root word améliorer, the French verb to improve. And so what I'm getting at here, crucially, is that Candide is a satire of optimism, a satire of those views of Leibniz and Pope that I've just described. Please don't accidentally think that because it's called Candide ou l'optimisme, it means that Candide is kind of a how to do optimism book. C'est bien le contraire. It is a critique of optimism. The character of Pangloss, so Candide's tutor, is a satirical, ridiculous mouthpiece of Leibniz and Pope. He's a man who blindly follows his philosophy of optimism, despite what is going on in the world around him, going back to my opening comments. And so do remember that Voltaire's Candide is not a celebration and certainly not a proof of optimism. Voltaire's world was filled with war, of needless slaughter and fleeing populations, which we see reflected in Candide. There isn't really time to go over these now, but if you're interested, you can look up some of the wars going on at the time. You can look up Frederick the Great of Prussia, whom Voltaire actually knew. That would be a good start. But there was also another event which really got Voltaire thinking about the meaning of life and about the travesty of bad things happening to good people. On the 1st of November 1755, All Saints' Day, a massive earthquake struck the Portuguese capital of Lisbon. And this event actually happens during our character's quest in Candide. This, along with the otherworldly phenomenon that we would now call a tsunami, virtually wiped Lisbon clean off the map. Almost 100,000 people died. Now put yourself in the early modern mentality. It's occurring on the morning of All Saints' Day, so the earthquake strikes when everybody's in church. So it starts to look a bit like the hand of God. The earthquake then, rather than being spread across a wide area, everybody's in church. So if you like, there are lots of eggs in not many baskets. And the biblical would seem to become even more obvious when people rush to the sea for safety. The sea, of course, had begun to recede in the early stages of the tsunami. And as people walked out to that receding shoreline, only to see a wave unlike anything they'd ever seen before, must have looked as if God himself was following them, picking off the survivors who hadn't died under the fallen church roofs, much like Moses' parting of the Red Sea and God's drowning of Pharaoh's army. Now, Voltaire reads the news of this with dismay, because many people were blaming Portugal's colonial exploits in South America for God's wrath upon them. And South America, as well as natural disaster, feature very heavily in Candide. Other people declared that, as catastrophic though the earthquake was, this Lisbon earthquake was part of God's wider, thoroughly good plan for the world. And basically, Voltaire can't believe that so many people think like this. But he was also touched by the human tragedy of the affair. How could this possibly be the best of all possible worlds? And in 1756, he wrote his Poème sur le désastre de Lisbonne, in which he attacks the optimists' all is for the best axiom for the first time. And then just a few years later, in 1759, Voltaire writes Candide. It's published anonymously because its satires are so biting and dangerous, particularly where men of religion are involved. The authorities immediately condemn the book, and the Parisian police, as it existed at the time, try to confiscate all of the 1,000 copies that Voltaire's publisher had sent to Paris. But it was too late. By April, there had already been 6 editions of the text. By the end of the year 1759, there had been 17 editions, as well as an Italian translation and 3 English translations. By 1803, 10 different works of fiction had appeared, which were inspired by Candide, or which were direct imitations of it. Flaubert, another famous French writer, read Candide over 100 times and even translated it into English just so that he could understand this little text from a different angle. So that gives us some intellectual, philosophical and historical context to Voltaire's Candide. And in our second video, what we'll do is we'll delve into the text itself and discover together what Voltaire has to tell us about the nature of the world and the nature of the human condition. I'll see you there.